Welcome back. There's a beautiful view outside. That's our new Sawtooth roofing camera up in Stacker Butte, Washington. Thanks for joining us on Afternoon Live. The grief one feels after losing a loved one is truly one of the hardest experiences a person can face in life. Our next guest has worked with those in grief for decades and is here to share the wisdom that he's learned. We welcome the author of Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief, and the Finding Meaning Workbook, David Kessler. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, so glad to be here with you.
I'm excited to learn about this concept of the 6th stage, but let's kind of back up. Can you remind us what the original 5 stages are? I think most of us might be a little bit familiar with those.
Sure. They were done by my co-author, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and they are denial, the I can't believe this is happening, anger, bargaining all the what ifs, if onlys, sadness, depression, and acceptance. And I always hear her whispering in my ear saying, and tell people they're not in order, they're not linear, there's no right way to do grief.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So let's move into this 6th stage. How did you come to this conclusion that, wait a minute, we got to add a category here?
Yeah, I've been working in grief for decades, and I was thrown into the epicenter of pain 8 years ago when my own younger son died. And, you know, I would watch myself going through all the experiences. Yep, you're in anger. Yeah, you're in sadness. And then when I began to think about, I'm going to have to accept this someday, it wasn't enough. I wanted more. And that more turned out to be meaning. I wanted to find meaning. And I think the thing that's confusing for people when they hear meaning, they might go, there's no meaning in a horrible death. There's no meaning in, you know, all these endings we have to deal with in our life, or a murder, or all these things. And I always remind people, murder is not in the horrible event. Sorry, meaning is not in the horrible event. Meaning is in us. It's what we do after the horrible event.
Sure, you don't have to necessarily answer the question of why this happened, but we're going to move forward and find that meaning in how we continue down the path.
And most of us never get a good why. I tell people, even if you get a why, it's never a satisfying why.
That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned earlier that the stages are not linear. Is that surprising to a lot of people that maybe they're hoping that they can kind of progress?
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that think, oh, this is going to be 5 easy steps. And unfortunately, there's no 5 easy steps for grief. And grief is very organic and messy, and you know, we just have to walk through it.
And everybody's experience is completely different, right? Even if maybe on paper a loss that you suffered might sound similar to somebody else, the way you experience it doesn't really have anything to do with what they've been through.
Absolutely. And grief shows up differently depending on our relationship with the person, how old they were, how they died. A million different things are factors. And I always like to mention, all grief is not death. I often say that, you know, death of a loved one. We also have breakups, divorce, estrangement, job loss. All those are also griefs in their own way.
Tell me about this concept of time when it comes to grief. I think some people have experienced this where maybe the 2nd or 3rd year after a big loss can even be tougher than that 1st year when you're not even really sure how you're navigating it. How does that all play out for us?
Yeah, such a good question, because we all have heard different stories about this. There was one study done around which was the worst, your 1st year, your 2nd, or both. And literally they tied. Some people found the worst year was the worst, some people the 2nd, and some said both. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, that it's just so different on everyone. Their 2nd year might have been the worst, but that doesn't have to be true for you.
Definitely. Do you have some exercises that you found that can help people who are struggling with grief?
Absolutely. And I just want to say it was fascinating. Someone said to me the other day, I bought your new workbook and I put it on the shelf. I'm not ready to go into the pain yet. And I said, thank you for buying it. And I just want to also say, you put the book on the shelf, but not the pain. You know, the pain is still in you. The workbook is how we move the pain out of us, which is so important. And the exercises, some of them are open-ended questions But some are things like disloyalty checklists. Like sometimes we don't realize we feel it's disloyal to continue living or to have a life after loss. So there's all kinds of little exercises. And it's, there's a thing these days, people say you need to do your grief work. And I've been training therapists and coaches for years. And I always wanted to give people answers to this is the grief work. And the workbook is set up to be that grief work that you can do at your own pace. You don't have to have started the first book. You can go right to the workbook.
What about, have you encountered folks who maybe they're in a situation where they've got a loved one with maybe a terminal illness and they're anticipating this death and this loss coming? Are there ways that we can prepare ourselves and our loved ones to navigate that time when you unfortunately can just see it in your future?
Yeah, I always say to people when we're talking about anticipatory grief to remember there's two things to do. One, we want to feel that grief that's ahead of time. It's normal. And the second thing is to also understand that don't show up at the funeral early. You still want to be there and be present with them.
It's not easy, but it's possible if you kind of set your intentions that way and want to enjoy that time that you have, if at all possible.
And to just have those hard conversations with them. And one of the things, whether it's a friend in grief or a friend who's about to go through it, we all look for the right words. And it's completely okay to say, I don't have the words, but I just want you to know I love you and I'm here and I'm going to walk next to you on this journey.
Yeah, saying something is always better than staying silent because you're not sure what to say. What about music? Do you have ways that music can be used as a tool to help people through grief?
Oh my gosh, I have an online grief group and it's hundreds of people. And I got to tell you, sometimes we have a music day and people love sharing the songs that connect us to our loved ones. Music is such a great expression of our grief in so many ways because, ultimately grief is love and music's often about that love.
That's so great to hear. Hey, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. It was great chatting with you.
And if you don't mind, in our new modern world, I show this because there's fake AI versions of this out there now.
Okay, this is the real one.
I want people to get the right one.
Okay.
They can find it at grief.com or griefbook.
Perfect. And hey, we're going to have all that information about the Finding Meaning Workbook on our website at katu.com. We'll be right back with more Afternoon Live right after this.